David. Our last speaker on the panel is Abayomi. He's a leader of the Moratorium Now Coalition in Macau, the editor of the Pan-African Newswire, as well as a contributing editor for Workers' World newspaper. And he will be kind of bringing it home for us now. Dare to struggle, dare to win. Which side are you on? And that's enough for me to say. I'll hand it over to Abayomi.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And this has really been an exciting 2 days. I think it's very important that we, of course, not only put out, but also evaluate and update our positions on these very, very important questions of the day. It's also great to have our comrades and friends here from other Midwest regions, and honestly, we need to do this more often. Get together and, kick it around, What I'm going to talk about in concluding this, of course, revolves around some of the strategic outlook that we have approached the struggle from here in the city of Detroit, and the lessons from that, and its implications for the African American national question, and indeed the African Revolution and how that fits into the world revolutionary process. Detroit, of course, is the largest per capita African American populated city in the United States. So I don't think it's an accident that we've been attacked in this manner in this current epoch of the U.S. economic crisis, but it is indeed a world economic crisis. Now, what's important about what we've done here in the city of Detroit and our contribution is that we've been able to define the struggle in a way that goes to the root of the crisis. We don't deal with the superficial aspects of the crisis. We try to go right to the heart of it. Now, in order to build an effective struggle to fight against the current onslaught against working people and the nationally oppressed, we must be clear about what is the source of the problem.
Yes.
In a city like Detroit, with the majority African American population, which dominates the political institutions such as the mayor's office in the past, not today, they made sure of that, and also the city council, which is still majority African American, with one Latina woman who was brought on last year. The election commission, still run by an African American woman. There was a charter commission that drafted the new city charter, which today has essentially been thrown out the window because of the imposition of Public Act 436 and the emergency management and indeed the bankruptcy. And we had a discussion about this last week in a national conference call. I had asked one young attorney about 4 years ago when they were putting together this charter, because we've been talking about these situations for the last 4 or 5 years. We're not soothsayers or mystics, but we actually predicted, that this situation would evolve because the ruling class, in essence, told us, what their plans were, and we pay attention to what they say. I asked this young woman, I said, well, what happens if the city is put under receivership under a consent decree or in the bankruptcy? What happens to the charter that was drafted and voted on in 2009, 2010? She said, I don't know. This is somebody who was heavily involved in drafting this charter, which is supposed to govern the operations of the city at least for 10 years. So they weren't even thinking along those lines. This is someone who's an attorney, one of the leading corporate law firms here in the city of Detroit, and you ask a fundamental question: what happens if the state of Michigan, at the behest of the corporate community, takes over the political institutions of the city of Detroit? What happens to the charter? And they say they don't know. Well, we've seen what's happened to the charter. For example, the charter says that if the water department, if there's a fundamental change in the management and ownership of the water department, it's supposed to go to a vote of the people of the city of Detroit, and 60%, 3 out of 5 voters have to support those changes. There's not even a discussion, even in city council, in the community organizations, public meetings, nothing is being discussed about these major transformations that are being undertaken here in the city of Detroit. Whether we talk about Belle Isle, public lighting, whether we talk about the water department, all of these things are being done behind our backs, above our heads, and totally out of the public view, as if it doesn't matter. This is why it's so important that we've intervened in this bankruptcy, both politically as well as legally. I mean, it's almost unprecedented to have people out in front of a bankruptcy court, saying cancel the debt and make the banks pay. That's why it got international attention. The school board, we've seen what's happened under emergency management in the Detroit public schools. Organizers must continue to emphasize that the economy of the city is still controlled by the capitalist class, which is exclusively white and based outside the city limits. That is the reality of the situation. All these attorneys, Jerry has commented on this numerous times, who are supposed to be representing the city of Detroit, they all come from New York City and other places. They totally whited out the presence of African-American attorneys, judges, politicians, and so forth. The city has a law department, remember? Right. Comrade in our party who works there said, what are the attorneys doing in the law department? Nothing. What a waste of human resources. They've totally silenced, the city of Detroit Law Department. The Corporation Council doesn't have a role in this whole process. It's absolutely outrageous. This phenomenon is somewhat similar to the conditions that prevail on the African continent and many other post-colonial states, including in South America and the Caribbean and Central America, where despite the attainment of national independence, South America, they had independent struggles going all the way back in the 19th century. Solomon, Bolivar, and many of the others. In Mexico, they had an independent government in the second decade of the 19th century. Even an Afro-Mexican president was the second head of state in Mexico and so forth. Nonetheless, the economic source of power still resides in the hands of the former colonial masters or the United States, which today is the #1 imperialist power in the world, no question about it. The complexity of this situation requires a global class analysis, which we bring to not only the left movement in this country, but also to the mass struggle. And the international division of labor and economic power, which is still in the hands of the so-called 1% of the capitalist class, which is getting smaller and smaller as we speak. Consequently, no matter what the class composition or orientation of the political figures operating inside these post-colonial states, the role of the world capitalist system remains paramount. That's why our struggle has to be against international finance capital, both domestically as well as internationally. We have left groups in this country. I was at the Left Forum back in June. This group that's heavily on the West Coast, they even had somebody elected to the city council in Seattle. And what is their line? Their line is that the U.S. is no longer the dominant imperialist country in the world.
No, who is it?
Hey, they won't say who it is. They claim it's some type of mixed bag of various countries and so on and so forth. Well,
Russia.
They came into one of the panels where we were discussing these issues and they wanted to debate us on it and so forth, but they had no real fundamental issues. They sent me a document a couple of weeks later that quoted from Antoine Gramsci's prison letters, from back during the early part of the 20th century. Had nothing to do with what's going on now. Who destroyed Iraq? Who destroyed Libya? Who's destroying Syria? Who's destroying Colombia? Who's destroying working people and the oppressed here inside the United States? It's quite obvious to us who the real culprits are. Yesterday, Comrade Brian raised the legacy of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. He was a leader of the African Revolution during the post-World War II period. But interestingly enough, he went to university here in the United States between 1935 and 1945. He was from a former British colony known as the Gold Coast, later became Ghana. He worked heavily with the left movement and the Pan-African movement here in this country, people like W.B. Du Bois, people like C.L.R. James, and others. And he knew U.S. racism and imperialism because he had lived here during the Great Depression. He had to work, low-wage jobs in order to put himself through school. He hooked up with the movement here. He went to England in 1945. He went back to Ghana in 1947 to lead the revolution there, which became a fountainhead of the progressive movement on the continent. Now, Nkrumah called this phenomenon neo-colonialism. In 1965, he published a book entitled Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Similar to Lenin's Imperialism, The High Stage of Capitalism. He updated that some 50 years later with Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, which analyzes the challenges facing Africa and other regions struggling to throw off the colonial yoke and to build independent national states. According to Nkrumah, quote, this is in 1965, the essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside, unquote. 3 years later, Nkrumah wrote another book entitled The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. Now this book, it's not just about military tactics and guerrilla warfare. He starts off the book with a chapter entitled Know the Enemy. This is the first section of the book, and he says, Nkrumah states that on the first page that, quote, a number of external factors affect the African situation. And if our liberation struggle is to be placed in correct perspective, and we are to know the enemy, the impact of these factors must be fully grasped. First among them is imperialism, for it is mainly against exploitation and poverty that our peoples revolt. It is therefore of paramount importance to set out the strategy of imperialism in clear terms, unquote. And Nkrumah continues by pointing out that, quote, once the components of the enemy's strategy are determined, we will be in a position to outline the correct strategy for our own struggle in terms of our actual situation in accordance with our objectives, both in the colonial territories and in the metropolitan states, meaning, the so-called oppressed nations and the imperialist countries, which he refers to as the metropolitan states, the United States, Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and so forth. The struggle was being waged against the same enemy, international finance capital under its external and internal forms of exploitation, imperialism, and capitalism, unquote. That was written in 1968, and unfortunately is still very true today. The capitalist class in Detroit is responsible for the current crisis involving joblessness, home foreclosures and evictions, utility shutoffs, and the usurpation of political power from existing elected bodies. They're responsible for police repression and the lack of health care and quality education. Therefore, the emphasis of our overall political strategy, the tactics that we utilize, the demands we advance, and the slogans we chant must always point to the actual source of the problem. Now, this is what our contribution has been here in the city of Detroit. When this whole thing began to develop, people were saying, yes, they're stealing our vote, they're stealing democracy, and we agree with that. But why are they stealing our vote? Why are they stealing bourgeois democratic practice? Because the capitalist system can no longer afford it.
That's right.
That's why they're doing it. And this has been our contribution to the struggle here in Detroit. This is important because the ruling class will always attempt to blame the workers for their misfortune and poverty.
Right.
In the current discussion around the economic crisis in Detroit, the corporate media never points out the role of the automotive companies and their failed policies related to capital flight, the undermining of organized labor, outsourcing, downsizing, and the lowering of wages. As a result of these conditions and distortions of history, in the current situation inside the city, the workers and the oppressed are attacked viciously and made to feel that their plight is a result of a lack of correct values and hard work. We hear it all the time. Yeah. You don't want to work for nothing, People in Detroit are corrupt. All these lies that they promote to us through the editorial pages of the Detroit News and Detroit Free Press. If we look at the previous regime of Dave Bing, the emergency manager Kevin Orr, the current mayor Mike Duggan from Livonia, they take their entire playbook from the banks and the multinational corporations. We talk about them as agents, though, of the system. We don't attack them personally. We don't have to attack them personally. If it wasn't Kevin Orr, there would be somebody else. If it wasn't Mike Duggan, it would be somebody else. If it wasn't Dave Bing a couple of years ago, it would have been somebody else. Benny Napoleon or whoever would have played that same role. Just read Detroit Cranes, which is like the Wall Street Journal of Detroit. 4 years ago, the Citizens Research Council issued a report on Detroit. And then there was the famous report from the Kresge Foundation, so-called philanthropic group. And anyone can conclude that the policies of the successive city administration, their initiatives are those of the capitalist class who created the crisis. The Citizens Research Council of Michigan in April of 2010 issued a report entitled, quote, "The Fiscal Conditions of the City of Detroit," unquote. It represented a blueprint for the ruling class on how to further the exploitation, impoverishment, and disempowerment of the people of this area. This is not surprising when one reads who is on the board of directors and the trustees of the Citizens Research Council. And who are these people? These officers represent institutions such as Ernst & Young. They were the ones that put out that bogus audit. Remember 2 years ago they said Detroit was on the brink of disaster? They have to do something. This is all politicized. Deloitte, which used to be Deloitte and Touche, or Touche Ross, and then it became Deloitte and Touche, now it's Deloitte. The Detroit Economic Club, which is like the capitalist, club here in Detroit. Wells Fargo Bank. DTE Energy, that's responsible for the desertification of Detroit through the utility shutoffs. We've been fighting that for the last several years. You cut off people's heat, you cut off their lights. How can they live in a home? It's going to be very difficult. Comerica Bank, General Motors Corporation, they all sit on these stuff like the Citizens Research Council, Kresge Foundation, and so forth.
And how do they call themselves citizens?
Yes, right.
Citizens of...
Yeah, corporate, it should be the Corporate Citizens Research
They call
Council.
themselves the Citizens Council, the racist group.
Right.
Then, of course, Kelly Services.
Oh,
Those great folks there. And Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, to name a few. How can these capitalist interests craft policies for Detroit's future when they themselves are the real culprits behind the crisis that we are facing today?
That's right.
Now, in 2010, it's quite interesting. This is over 4 years ago. In the introduction to the Citizens Research Council report, it states that clearly, it's quote, "Clearly the city government cannot afford to remain at its present size." This is 4.5 years ago they were saying this. There are 4 ways the government can downsize. All right, number 1, the elected mayor, who was Dave Bing at the time, and the city council can develop and implement required changes. The mayor, that was the first thing, okay? The elected officials were mandated, to impose austerity. They couldn't do it fast enough and efficiently enough for the ruling class. Then it says the second solution. The mayor and the city council can implement changes specified in a consent agreement reached with a review team appointed by the state officials under the Local Government Fiscal Responsibility Act. They did that 2 years later with the so-called Financial Stability Agreement, okay? The third solution, an emergency financial manager appointed under the Local Government and Fiscal Responsibility Act can negate the authority of the mayor and the city council, can implement changes, and can renegotiate but not abrogate contracts. That was the third solution. And then, of course, the final solution, if an emergency financial manager recommends and the state approves, reorganization and restructuring can occur under the protection of bankruptcy, which does allow contracts to be abrogated. No Michigan municipality has ever filed under federal bankruptcy laws, unquote. So they've been planning this for a long time, Congress, and they told us they were doing this. We were paying attention, but a lot of these other tendencies were not paying attention. The report goes on to say that, quote, "In order to address what would be an accumulated general fund deficit exceeding $400 million, Detroit City's government must be restructured. The new structure must reflect both the reduced tax base and the limited ability of state governments to provide shared revenues," unquote. Such a program of corporate dictatorship and dismantling must be rejected by the people of Detroit, and that's where our role comes in. People must organize to oppose the implementation of these plans by the corporate community and their agents in the local government. Even after the bankruptcy, we're still going to be stuck with billions and billions of dollars of debt to the banks, and the austerity is going to even intensify. Now, in addressing these efforts on the part of the capitalist class and their agents, we must be organized around a political program that attacks the exploitative and racist system at its base. This is why we have, for the last several years, called for the immediate implementation of a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions in order to keep the people in their homes in Detroit. The failure of the city administration, the state legislature, and the governor to impose a moratorium has resulted in a large-scale destruction of the housing stock in the city and throughout the region. With the school systems being heavily dependent on tax revenues for its operations, it is not surprising that there have been huge cuts in education, not only in Detroit but throughout the state. Therefore, the appointment of an emergency financial manager over the DPS in actuality represents the inability of the elected politicians to effectively address the problems stemming from predatory lending, job losses, and decline in wages. The appointment of emergency managers also represents the failure of capitalist economic policies. Banks, insurance companies, and multinational corporations have looted the cities through corrupt mortgage schemes, redlinings, tax avoidance. Many of these firms do not pay any taxes to the cities, yet they continue to insist that they dominate the political and economic direction of the elected bodies of local governments. And in fact, a lot of the tax dollars that we pay into the system are utilized by the corporate community through what they call tax captures. They do it with the public schools, they do it with the public libraries and other public entities. This thing they're building, this new hockey arena and entertainment district, we're paying the bulk of the costs surrounding that. There's no guarantee that Detroit people will get hired on any of these jobs. It was never written into the contract. You go there and you can sweep the ground, you know, you may be able to sell some popcorn and peanuts, but you're not going to get a permanent job with benefits out of this whole process. So this is what we're dealing with, brothers and sisters. Efforts to seize the municipal pension funds, we've been opposing. They canceled the health care programs of the retirees on March 1st. We've seen the privatization of the Detroit Medical Center, which was a nonprofit entity, sold to Vanguard Corporation, which has been sold to another entity now. The Pentagon budget, $700, $800 billion a year. Money drained that could go towards rebuilding the economy of the United States. Could be utilized to fund jobs, housing, healthcare, senior services, child services, and quality education for all. Consequently, the opposition to imperialism internationally can serve as a rallying point for both exposing the hypocrisy of the United States ruling class, as well as building a working class solidarity throughout the world. The national security state apparatus of the U.S. is not directed against the so-called war on terrorism, which is being evoked again by Secretary of Defense Hagel, who says that ISIS is the worst thing that we have ever seen. Well, we've heard that before.
Worse than Osama?
Yes. Always a new enemy that's worse than the previous enemy. In raising these demands, we would point to the theoretical basis of the struggle. Ultimately, the only solution to the current crisis of the capitalist system is the transformation of the economy and social structures towards socialism. This will require a total break with capitalism and imperialism and a protracted struggle for the realization of a society based on scientific socialist principles. Now, we're not idealists, you know, we don't have crystal balls. We do have history. And we know what has happened, and we know what is going on right now. And on that basis, as Lenin talked about, you know, the concrete conditions, concrete analysis based on the concrete conditions, this is all we have as organizers. V.R. Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution and the founder of the Soviet Union, stated as early as 1903 that, quote, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. The idea cannot be insisted upon too strongly at a time when the fashionable preachings of opportunism goes hand in hand with an infatuation for the narrowest forms of practical activity. This is what Lenin said over 100 years ago. At this point, Lenin continues, we wish to state only that the role of the vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory, unquote. Lenin goes on to point out in this very important work that, quote, since there could be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement, the only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. There's no middle course, Lenin says, for humanity has not created a third ideology, And moreover, in a society torn by class antagonisms, there can never be a non-class or above-class ideology. We hear other groups advancing, non-class ideology. There's no such thing. Either you with the workers and the oppressed, or you with the bourgeoisie. That's the bottom line. Quote, hence to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, Lenin says, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree means to strengthen bourgeois ideology.
That's right.
There's much talk of spontaneity, but the spontaneous development of the working class movement leads to a subordination to bourgeois ideology. 2, its development along the lines of the Credo program for the spontaneous working class movement is trade unionism. And trade unionism means the ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie, unquote. And we've learned that lesson again in Detroit. This is the best we can get. We heard some of the union leaders say they didn't even wage a struggle.
That's right.
They should have said, this is the best that the Moratorium Now coalition could get. Under the circumstances. Because that's the reality of the situation. Because they were talking about 84% cuts in pensions a year ago. And now they got another way by robbing the annuities of taking that money. Another revolutionary leader in Africa, Amilcar Cabral, who headed the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, the PAIGC, he pointed out in a directive to his organization in 1965 that cadres must, quote, always bear in mind that the people are not fighting for ideas or the things in anyone's heads. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children, unquote. Cabral ended this directive by saying that, quote, we must practice revolutionary democracy in every aspect of party life. Every responsible member must have the courage of his responsibilities, exacting from others a proper respect for his work and properly respecting the work of others. Hide nothing from the masses of our people. Cabral says, tell no lies. Expose lies whenever they are told. Mask no difficulties, mistakes, and failures. Claim no easy victories, unquote. And in closing, I would just like to mention 2 other things. With this being a majority African-American city, and with these attacks being directed towards the public sector, many African Americans, and many women and Latinos were able to find employment, secure employment in the public sector. And of course, this is why, in my opinion, it's being attacked so vigorously right now. So these are racist and sexist attacks as well. Now, the failure of the Reconstruction era is still with us today. We had the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s, and then of course with the labor movement, winning gains in the 1930s that we discussed yesterday. They're trying to reverse all of these gains that have been made over the last 80 years, since the uprising of 1934 and sit-downs of 1937, the Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and 60s and 70s, the Black Power movement, the women's movement, and so forth. Today we have the advantage of looking back at the historical developments of Reconstruction and the Civil Rights eras of African American history. At present, the world capitalist system headed by the U.S. is facing the worst crisis since the Great Depression. Even though there have been monumental changes within the political and economic system within the United States and the world, the slave period fundamentally, America is still a class-dominated society, with corporations and banks dominating all social institutions. The white-only signs have been removed, but the barriers to social progress and genuine freedom have remained erected. The federal government indices through the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the U.S. Census clearly indicate that poverty and structural unemployment is rising among African Americans and other nationally oppressed groups. This is occurring under the leadership of an African American president who represents the Democratic Party, which many people within this community identifies with. You got all these African American Democrats in Detroit, politicians and others. And yet, the president has not made one statement in defense or in support of the African American people of the city of Detroit. And even the Democratic Party operatives and apparatchiks They fear even putting pressure on the president because they say it will benefit the racists if we start leaning on Obama too hard. Well, he doesn't have to run for office again.
That's right.
This is the excellent time to put forward demands
That's
to the
right.
president. Why haven't they even had a car caravan to drive to Washington, D.C. and demand a meeting with the president or somebody in his office to say, hey, they're killing us here in Detroit. We been loyal to the Democratic Party. You know, help us out.
That's right.
We hear nothing.
Stand up.
We hear absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Has the political culture in the U.S. changed in regard to how African Americans are viewed within the mass media and among the dominant social groups and classes? As during the period of Reconstruction and its aftermath, the racist notions of inferiority still exist within the corporate media and the educational system.
That's right.
Interestingly enough, comrades, in the aftermath of Reconstruction, the Southern historians sympathetic to the slave system dominated the interpretation of this social experiment. A century later, the educational system and the corporate media minimizes and distorts the meaning of the civil rights and black power movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
That's right.
Therefore, one aspect of raising political consciousness is to provide an historical materialist view of race relations and national oppression in the United States and the world. This is why we initiated 10 years ago the Martin Luther King Day in Detroit to resurrect the actual life of Dr. King related to his anti-war and social justice legacy. The necessity exists as well for the periods of slavery, Reconstruction, and the upsurge of the mid to late 20th century. The ruling class will always distort the history of the workers and the oppressed for its own benefit, aimed at continuing the exploitation and oppression of its natural adversaries. One point of continuity of the ruling class interpretation of history is the notion that African Americans cannot rule themselves or others within society.
Right.
The racist historians of slavery and Reconstruction claim that the system of bondage was well suited to the African American people. Reconstruction politicians and organizations are portrayed as inherently corrupt and inefficient. Sounds familiar?
Yep.
Consequently, the dominant ruling class interests are compelled to take control of the system completely for the good of not only the oppressed, but also the dominant social class. We witness this on a daily basis in the city of Detroit. The corporate media narrative says that Detroit is facing financial ruin due to the corruption and the lack of management skills of the majority African American population. However, the corporations and the banks which have robbed and exploited the people of Detroit for decades are never criticized. In fact, they are viewed as the key component and the solution to the crisis. This is an ideological position that attempts to legitimize the continuing racism and national oppression fostered by the capitalist system. Our contribution in this period is to vociferously attack these views without mercy.
That's right.
There is much data and historical record to support our position that the crisis in Detroit and the United States and the world is rooted in the system of profit that has continued to exploit the workers and oppressed at ever greater levels. The situation in Detroit mirrors the world economic crisis. The astronomical rates of joblessness all throughout Europe, all throughout the Middle East, all throughout Africa. Escalating indebtedness to the banks, as Cheryl alluded to earlier. 13 years ago, Argentina had a rebellion against the international debt. And now they're right back at their doorstep again. They'll come back to us again. Rising state repression. We can see Ferguson. We can see New York. 5,000 demonstrated yesterday against police repression. And finally, the inability of the ruling class to provide any rational answers or effective solutions. They don't even advance any. When have they talked about creating jobs? When have they talked about ameliorating poverty, let alone ending poverty? They don't even discuss it because they know they have no solution to offer to the people. Consequently, our task is to not only seek answers to the pressing questions of the day, but to grapple with a political program of action. The system must be uprooted and fundamentally transformed. Reform is no longer an option, no longer a long-term option. The system is a problem and must be destroyed to make way for a new one based upon the needs of the majority of the people within society. The lessons of the struggle against slavery, against Jim Crow, against domestic neocolonialism, war is the outgrowth of the profit system and cannot be eliminated without challenging the system at its root. The challenge must involve us all. And we appeal to everyone here who are members of the party and friends of the party, interested in the party, to join us in this effort. We need cadre. We need organizers. We need people to go out in the communities and the workplaces to organize, to do propaganda work. This is the challenge that we're facing right now. Thank you so much, Carmen.